Carla, hello. Welcome to Curiosity Nest. Thanks for being here.
Hi, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Cool. Well, excited to talk because this is now, it's the 400th anniversary of all this Pilgrim stuff, isn't it?
Of the Mayflower, right.
The Mayflower,
right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the Mayflower landed in December in 1620, so.
1620. 1620 sounds old, but 400 years ago, it doesn't even feel that long. Isn't that weird?
Right. That puts it in a certain perspective. That's true.
Yeah.
But, there's not too much older than that that's associated with the United States.
That's true.
At least in terms of the way we tell the national history.
Right, yeah. And that you're, what's that?
Roanoke, right? 1587. That's the earliest.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because that's kind of something that kind of came, I think a lot of people think like Plymouth was the first kind of settlement, but it wasn't really.
No. Well, 1587, Roanoke was an attempt, 1586-87, but really the first one in what would become the 13 colonies of the United States is Jamestown in Virginia, 1607.
Okay.
We don't count Puerto Rico.
Oh.
Which is a lot earlier.
What's the story of Puerto Rico?
Well, Puerto Rico, is now part of the United States, but it was originally a Spanish colony and it was settled shortly after Columbus. So, yeah. So it's more like it's past 500 years.
Right. It's so
In fact,
crazy.
This is the 500th anniversary of the first slaves being taken to Puerto Rico.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was never taught to me.
Yeah, well, you should take one of my classes.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, I'm so glad that's why you're around. You're sharing this stuff that it's just like, It's crazy. How would I even know to look into this stuff? That's why
Well, there was a lot of stuff about 1619 last year around slavery in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a number of events associated with that. And, whenever I was invited to those, I would always say, by the way,
right, yeah.
Puerto Rico. Well, because some of my work has been on the Caribbean. So I think more about that maybe than some other, quote unquote, U.S. historians would do. So.
Okay. No, I see. And that kind of something that you focus on. Well, we should mention your book. It's not officially out yet. It's coming out.
No, actually, it's in the mail on its way to me right now. And I was really hoping it would come before this talk so I could hold it up, but it's not here yet. It's due out on October 6th.
Okay.
Which is less than a month away. Yeah. But they always send the author advance copies.
Sure.
So, as soon as they physically make copies, they put some in the mail to the author. So I got an email last week that they were sending it, but they haven't arrived yet. So.
Cool. Well, congrats. That's exciting. And the book is called The World of Plymouth Plantation, correct?
Right.
Okay. And it sort of focuses on more like who the Pilgrims were as people and more of like their stories and day-to-day life. Is that right?
Well, it really makes the case that Plymouth is a place that's connected to other places.
Okay.
We tend to picture Plymouth as isolated. If you think about, there's very famous images associated with Plymouth and the Mayflower, and it's always, emphasizes isolation. They arrived in winter and it was cold and icy and this sort of barren shore, and there were a few native peoples, but otherwise they're all alone out there, the first, that's kind of the image that we have.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, in emphasizing the suffering and the hardship, that image of isolation has gotten emphasized, and it's not untrue, but in fact, you couldn't have Plymouth Plantation if it wasn't connected to all kinds of other places from the very beginning and throughout its history. So I'm actually thinking about those kinds of connections, and some of them have to do with very basic material things like, where do you get your clothing?
Right, sure.
You couldn't get very far without having connections to other places.
Right.
So it does get into kind of everyday life issues, but it gets into a variety of aspects. So.
Okay. Man, very cool. Yeah, I'm excited to do it. So can we just kind of go through, I guess, the story a little bit of like, so why did they initially want to go to North America.
Basically who they were.
Yes, yeah.
So, well, there's a famous narrative of their history, which was written by one of them, a man by the name of William Bradford, who was frequently their governor.
Right.
And he wrote, a little later in his life, he wrote the story as he wanted it to be remembered. And that has become the narrative that is written about Plymouth when people write books or whatever. So it's as good a place to start as any, although it is just one version of the story. So the way he tells it is the Protestant Reformation in England was a great thing, but it was incomplete. And a small group of Christians in Nottinghamshire decided that because it was incomplete, they needed to ignore what the established legal national church, the Church of England, was doing and do basically what they thought was right. And they did that for a short while, and then they decided they needed to leave. Mm-hmm. They needed to go to the Netherlands in order to freely practice their religion. And they have a kind of harrowing escape story, which he narrates as the church tries to get out of England, and they have various difficulties, and finally they all end up in Amsterdam. And then from there they decide they're going to locate in Leiden. And so they establish a church in Leiden, which is led by their pastor, who's a man by the name of John Robinson, who's actually a quite well-educated, highly regarded minister. And he leads their little church until some of them decide that they want to leave the Netherlands and go now to the American colonies, which are beginning to be developed by England. And so they can't really go back to England with their religious views, but they think they can go, they get a deal where they can basically go to a colony. So they're the only one that exists at that time in North America is Virginia. Mm-hmm. But it has an enormous land grant that goes all the way up like Delaware, like the southern, part of Pennsylvania. Uh-huh. And so they're trying to go to what they think of as North Virginia.
Right.
And they miss it. They end up, on Cape Cod, basically. Now, there's some controversy about why they missed it. Some people say, it was a conspiracy by the captain or, there's some crazy stories. But I think, in fact, it's just not that well known how to navigate to this area. And it's not that easy to do in a sailing ship in 1620. And they arrive very late in December. Mm. And it's dangerous to try to sail. It's easier to sail north than it is to sail south. Oh. Plus, they have to go around Cape Cod. So they decide they're just going to stay where they are and not try to get to Virginia in, January or whatever it would have been by then. So they stay in New England, where they have no permission to be. They basically had a deal with the Virginia company that they could go to Virginia, but they're in New England, and there's a group of English elites who sort of think they own New England.
Okay.
Obviously, the native people who live there don't agree, but those would have been the people they should have approached if they had thought that's where they were going. So that's one thing they have to end up sorting out. But when they arrive, they realize that they have no basis for being where they are, and they decide that they have to come up with some basic agreement about how they're going to govern themselves, which is what we now remember as the Mayflower Compact.
Right.
Sure. Document that basically says, here we are, not where we meant to be. We agree that this is how we're going to manage our affairs, basically. So all the men who are on the Mayflower, except I can't remember if the servants actually sign it. No one would expect it to matter whether adult male servants signed or not. But the men who are at least the heads of households sign it. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a famous document later in American history. Right. So they kind of tool around the area for a while, little exploratory, visits onto shore. And then they finally come ashore, find an old abandoned native village site, start building there, and they spend the winter, in dreadful conditions, living in like little shacks that they've been able to throw up. Mm-hmm. About half of them die. Yeah, there's like 100 people and 50 of them, die. So the ship's crew has to stay with them through the winter because it can't go anywhere at the time. Some of its crew are ill, some of them have died. They need to kind of recover enough to sail home. So at the end of, in the spring, they finally are able to leave, and they leave this just few people here. And it's only when the ship gets back to England that anybody knows where they are, which is, kind of interesting to think about. It could have been. Right. So they make contact with local native peoples. They find out that the village is abandoned because there was a terrible epidemic a few years beforehand that wiped out a lot of people and changed the kind of composition of the, native communities in that area and where people were, what land people were using, et cetera. And they make an alliance basically with a local native leader, and they begin their effort at setting up a settlement, which they call Plymouth Plantation.
Okay.
They're joined over the next few years by more shiploads with more people in them, and they eventually, the population comes back and then exceeds 100 and gradually grows. A lot of the people who went were already in family units. Unlike the people who go to Virginia, there are women as well as men in the initial voyage, and so babies are being born, and the population is growing also through the fact of the family formation, and so they gradually become a small. First one little town, and then a couple of other little towns are founded around it as their population grows enough.
Okay.
What really changes the situation in that region is that in 1630, a huge number of people start migrating into what will become Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Oh.
So north of Plymouth, which is on Cape Cod, up by what's today Boston and Salem, huge numbers of people from England start pouring in, and some of those people overflow into the Plymouth Plantation area and add to that population. But then, the whole landscape changes with this the 20,000 people migrate into New England in a 10-year period starting in 1630. And so that really changes the dynamic. So it's really only those first 10 years that they're sort of there more or less on their own.
Okay.
They last as a separate entity with, their own little jurisdiction until the 1680s, when they basically get canceled. And after 1692, they're part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and even today they're a county within the state of Massachusetts. But for a period, they had been their own little entity. So.
Right. Okay, yeah, because you mentioned this, but I'm unclear on how it works. So they were going to go to Virginia. They missed it. They ended up, where Plymouth is. And so that really didn't have England didn't really have jurisdiction over that, or did they?
Well, okay. Spain says everything in both Americas except for Brazil belongs to Spain.
Okay.
So theoretically, the Spanish, quote unquote, discovered among the Europeans the Americas, and they claim it all. The English and others, the French, the Dutch, are starting to make inroads into areas that the Spanish haven't actually occupied.
Okay.
So that's tricky because Spain is a very powerful country at this time. So you don't just, if you're the English monarch, you don't just want to say, we know you say it's yours, but we don't care. You want to be a little more
respectful,
diplomatic, or quiet, or, so there's a slow move toward, taking land within the Americas. So it takes a long time before the Spanish government actually acknowledges that these other Europeans have any right to be in the Americas.
Okay.
Which doesn't stop the English from saying Virginia belongs to us, Virginia, which is a massive colony in their original thinking, belongs to us. New England belongs to us. At the same time, the Swedes are there, the Dutch are there, the French are there. Like, there's no, there's no saying who it would have ended up in the hands of.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the very beginnings of a slow, long process in which England, later Britain, would basically take everything north of Florida, south of Nova Scotia, and basically claim it all and occupy it all. But that takes, 150 years or whatever. So
Right. Okay. I see. Okay. And then so just the Mayflower Compact was just kind of their way of just trying to create something for them as a...
Well, only about half the people who are on the Mayflower are connected to the Leiden Church.
Oh.
The other half are other people who were recruited by investors and others from England. Mm. So they're not a kind of organized community in a sense. They're people who were sort of thrown together by this desire to go. If they had gone to Virginia, they had a kind of government, how would we be governed sort of deal with Virginia.
Sure.
But since they didn't end up in Virginia, they say, well, like, now what are we going to do? We have no permission to be here. We don't have any basis to organize ourselves into any kind of an entity. So they just signed this agreement that basically says, we're going to work together to make this happen. And, people are not going to strike out on their own and, whatever. And they think that that's a temporary, like a stopgap measure. They try to get a charter from the king. They try to get permission to be there, and they never really succeed. They get these noble lords who are organizing this New England company to give them a patent, which allows them to own land if you assume that these elite Englishmen own the land and can give them the right to it.
Right.
But they never get anything saying you're allowed to have a government, you can set this up here. England will acknowledge you as a separate entity. They never get that. Other places in New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, those places get that kind of permission either right away or eventually, but Plymouth never does. And they stop trying, interestingly, eventually. What happens is the region fills up and the other colonies basically accept that they're there and don't mess with them. And that sort of seems like good enough. Like,
okay.
Until, of course, the king looks at them and says, oh, wait, you don't even have a charter I have to take away if I want to absorb you into a larger entity. So in that regard, it's like they're not as safe as they could have been. Mm-hmm. If they had their own charter, they might have stayed as an independent colony, but because they didn't, they just got absorbed into Massachusetts. So, But it's interesting when Bradford is narrating this early history of Plymouth Plantation, which is this very famous document. He doesn't even tell about the Mayflower Compact.
Really?
At first, like, he just skips over that, and then when he gets 10 years later, the compact has become more important because they haven't gotten anything else.
Sure. And
so when he starts the second book of his big manuscript, he says, before I tell what's happened since, in the recent times, I need to back up and tell about this civil combination, this legal agreement that we made at that start. And he backs his story up, describes the signing, gives the text. And that's because it's taken on a great deal more significance, because they're basically cobbling together that, the patent, whatever other things they have, agreements with local natives, whatever they have to sort of justify where they are.
Okay.
And when they thought they'd get a charter, they didn't need to sort of pull this and that together. So it's quite interesting that to them, it becomes more important because they're in a position of weakness. It then becomes much more important in the early United States because it's identified as an early democratic document. I would say misidentified as an early democratic document, but from the point of view of the early United States, that's interesting to them. They want to say, oh, look, these people are self-governing, let's emphasize that because we're now self-governing and this is part of our tradition. And,
right.
So it becomes named the Mayflower Compact, and it becomes a big deal only in the 19th century. So, yeah, they never even actually say the name Mayflower, which in any of the original sources, which is super fascinating given that we now have like Mayflower Compact, Mayflower Descendants, Mayflower 400th Anniversary.
Yeah. So where did that come from?
It's a very common name for a ship, and they don't, they're like, in that time,
right.
There's lots of Mayflowers sailing around, and to them it didn't seem particularly significant.
It wasn't a big deal. Wow. That's
amazing. So, it's how things become symbolic, over time. So, anyway.
So what do you mean when it was kind of misidentified as a Democratic document?
Well, they're trying to, when they sign that document, I should probably grab the text of it, but when they sign that document, they're thinking about how are we going to organize ourselves, but they're not thinking we need to be sure everybody gets a voice. It's not a democratic impulse. It's how are we going to control this out of control situation?
Sure.
So it's almost, in a way, it's almost the opposite of,
yeah, right.
Let's all vote on it and see what we, And some people have made a lot of the fact that it's a split group between the church members and the others, and that, presuming there's tensions there between the two, and therefore, all the church members could get along fine, but then they have all these extra people who might go off on their own or have their own ideas, and therefore, maybe they're just trying to corral everybody under the authority of the leaders in the church side, on the church side.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
But
so was it did they really at least the people who were part of the church, was that their motivation was that truly their motivation to go to North America was, for religious liberty?
Oh, that's a good question. No.
Oh, okay.
Basically, if you think about religious freedom as the motivation, there's really two problems with that. One is when we say religious freedom, we don't mean what they were doing. We think of freedom of religion, like people being free to have, their choice,
right?
Which they didn't care about. They only cared about their own personal choice.
Sure.
So it's I want to be free to do what's right, i.e. what I think is the way it should be done. They're not thinking as an abstract principle that people should be allowed to follow their own conscience. Mm-hmm. That's a slightly later idea. And that's the idea that in the early United States they want to support, is that it was about freedom of religion. But the other thing is, when they went to the Netherlands, they were as free as they could be religiously.
Oh.
So, because the Netherlands was the Netherlands during this period is a fascinating place, but it's a group of different provinces that they're rebelling against the Spanish monarchy, the Habsburgs, who run Spain, but also own a whole, Belgium and the Netherlands and a whole area in Central Europe.
Right.
And they've been in revolt against the Spanish for decades by the time the people from the church arrived to live in Leiden. And there's a 12-year truce in this long war for independence that they come during. So the church is established during this truce. But for a long time, the Netherlands has been a place that is a Protestant haven where English people who have unconventional Protestant views can go. Okay. So lots of Protestant books. When the Protestant Reformation is first happening in England, and it's not really clear how far it's going to go or what the king is going to say about it, books are published in the Netherlands in English in support of a more Protestant outcome to what's going on in England, because there are English expat communities there that are basically supportive of a more radical Reformation. So there's a long history of people who find whatever's going on in England uncomfortable, and they go to the Netherlands. So the fact that they do that, it's not at all surprising, except that they're a small, not very wealthy church, and it's a little tricky to do, but it's not, it's not unprecedented. Mm-hmm. There are other English churches there when they arrive.
Okay.
And they're allowed to do whatever they want. The Dutch allow them to practice the way they want to practice.
Okay.
And they actually establish a printing press for a while in their little community, and it is printing things that are opposed to the religious policies in England in English, and then they're getting smuggled into England. And the government in England comes to the Dutch government and says, you have to make them stop. You have to send them home. You have to, we need to punish them. And the press is closed down, but they're not punished. So, the Dutch government is willing to protect them and support them to some extent. So they're fine in the Netherlands in terms of practicing their religion. Yeah. They have other problems, like they don't all speak Dutch.
All right.
They don't have very much money. They find it difficult to get jobs, so they have all the immigrant problems. They sold their property and gave up a lot when they moved. Mm-hmm. And now here they are in this new community where it's difficult to make a start. So they are leaving for other reasons, not religious reasons.
Okay.
One source actually says they're worried, and some speculation by scholars has been that they're worried with the truce ending, that the war is going to resume, and they don't want to be in the middle of that.
Right.
And in fact, it does end, and the war does resume, and eventually, almost 30 years later, the Dutch finally get their independence and create an independent government that's not under the Habsburg monarchy. But there's fighting that happens before that, so it would be a reason not to be there.
Okay. So that they were like, it's not great here. We got to go somewhere where we can, practice our religion, and it's got to kind of do all these check boxes. So kind of what they saw their best option was to go to North America.
They can't go back to England.
Yeah.
It's clear with their religious views at that time. A few years later, it would be okay, but at that time, it's not okay. So when they first go to the Netherlands, they don't really have the option of America. But when they decide they are going to go to America, that option has now opened up. So there is the possibility you're under the English government, but you're not under the really strictly regulated church.
Right.
So it seems to them perfect. It's going to be English language, under the English government, but they're not going to interfere with what we are going to do religiously. So it kind of combines the best of staying in England with the best of staying in the Netherlands.
Right. Okay.
So they choose to go.
Yeah. Well, because there's
some of them do. About half the church goes.
Okay. Right. Good point. Not everybody.
And the other half stays in the Netherlands. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because that's, I don't know. You kind of think of it as them just leaving England, but they still think of themselves as English, and they're going to go to Virginia and still be kind of under.
Right.
English.
Right. And actually, when they're in New England, they go way out of their way to say, we are here as the representatives of the King of England. We are loyal subjects to James the First. And,
wow.
Which is really interesting given that they've been writing these critical pamphlets and having them tossed into England to criticize the church and the king, and also because they left, But they present, especially whenever they're talking to Native Americans or when they're talking to other Europeans, they're always presenting themselves as loyal subjects and representatives, and so it's fascinating, I think.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of why they would still be so loyal to the King of England?
Well, I think one thing is you don't want to be in America not tied to something. I mean, this is a region that has lots of different powerful groups in it, many of them native, but also now more and more Europeans. And there's lots of vying for position and et cetera. So I think having somebody behind you, having someone in Europe who's saying, these are our people and we might do something to protect them, even though they never actually do much to protect English people in the Americas in the 17th century. The idea that you have some kind of backing, I think, is attractive to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I could understand that.
Right.
Man, okay. And then it's
all the positives of that connection without the negatives.
Yeah, right. To them, it's a win-win.
Right.
Okay, and then I'm curious about the kind of the first Native American interactions, and that they do sign a kind of a peace treaty with the local tribe.
Yeah, well, the very first interactions are they are aware that there are people in the general area, and they hear them sometimes, they see them at a distance. So there's like this whole series of like, we know they're out there, they're not coming in, sort of weird kind of posturing sort of interactions. Yeah. And then a man walks into their little village and speaks to them in English.
Oh.
And this is a man named Samoset who had lived further up the coast where European fishermen have been coming for a long time, and he learned a little bit of English.
Wow.
So he comes in and talks to them briefly, and then promises that he'll bring somebody else whose English is better. Mm-hmm. And by this time, shortly after this, he comes back with a man that we remember as Squanto. Right. He's actually in the records more with a different version of his name, which is Tisquantum. But he has quite good English because he was kidnapped by an Englishman 6 years before and carried along with other people to be sold as a slave in Spain. Yikes. And so he has this fascinating story of having been kidnapped. They trick them onto a ship, they kidnap them, they take them to Spain, they go to sell them. And then for at least some of these men, they come to the attention of some Dominican friars who realize these are natives of the Americas, and natives of the Americas are vassals of the king and cannot be enslaved. And so they actually get them out of being sold as slaves and take them into their community. And, there is a scholar who's working on this right now and trying to track all this and figure out everything. And I don't know how much we know about the Spanish interlude, but he might give us more information eventually.
Ooh.
But he eventually makes his way back to England, up to England. And then from England, he gets on multiple voyages going toward America. And eventually is able to get back home.
Oh, okay.
But, he goes, because there's lots of fishing in the North Atlantic that comes out of Europe, and seasonally ships go into the Newfoundland fisheries up in that area where, cod fisheries. And they go in the warmer months and they do all this fishing and they dry the fish and then they bring it back to sell in Europe. And so he can get only so far.
Right, yeah.
Until finally he's able to get into, more into the region. And then he's able to make his way down. And he discovers that his home village is gone. This is actually the site where this epidemic, killed many people and others had dispersed by the time he returns. And so he actually finds that this Plymouth is established at the place where he had lived and where he had been kidnapped from. So
wow, that'd be a shocker.
Yeah. So it's really, he's a super interesting character because he has good English. He can speak also to the local native peoples who either speak the same language he did or a different variation on it. But he doesn't actually have his own community. So he kind of becomes more identified with Plymouth and more of an agent of Plymouth and works with them very closely. He only lives for a couple of years after this, but he is kind of their representative and their advisor. The records are super interesting, though, because it's quite clear he's playing his own game. Like, he's got his own ideas about what he wants to accomplish. And, so occasionally the Plymouth people are upset because he's representing things in a certain way that they, they would rather he not, or,
Sure.
He's maybe trying to, gain his own power in the situation. And so he's a really fascinating character who's, trying to build back up some kind of a local standing for himself.
Right.
That's facilitated by the fact that he can speak English. But close by, there is a Wampanoag community that he helps them get into contact with. And with that community, then a treaty is negotiated. In the records, they call the leader of that community Massasoit, but actually that name just means leader. Oh. So it's like a problem of translation.
Yeah.
So in all their records, they're always referring to him basically as leader.
Right. Yeah.
But he's the man who leads the community that they then create this alliance with, and they have an agreement that cross-cultural negotiations in various languages with an interpreter of questionable motives. Who knows what both sides thought? We know what the English document says, but what the native peoples thought they were getting into might be something slightly different.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. What would they, they're so lucky that whole Squanto had that crazy story and came back, because what would they have done without an interpreter?
Yeah, they treat him as if he was sent by God. And then he teaches them how the natives plant corn using corn and beans, and there's like a combination planting thing, corns, bean, and squash, that if you plant these plants together, you don't deplete the soil, and you dig a hole, you put a piece of fish in, then you plant these various things, and the corn stalk becomes what the vines trail itself up, and there's a whole thing he teaches them, which they say they're very grateful for, but then they end up not really using.
Oh, really?
They can't get out of the whole idea of like, we make rows, we're English,
right.
So we have to plant things in like little patches and rows and stuff. So, but early writers about Plymouth there's a set of very important writings that are produced by the people who were there. Mm-hmm. And then later those writings are discovered by people who are from the area in the later colonial period and the Revolutionary era, and they start retelling these stories to create Plymouth as an important origin moment. And one of the stories they really like is the story of Squanto and the planting of the corn and the the English are very conscious that he's been abused by English people, and they go on about the man who kidnapped him, and they're very negative about that, and they treat Squanto as if he's forgiven them for what their countrymen did, so they're very aware that this was badly handled, and they try to distance themselves from that individual. They meet a woman whose three sons were all kidnapped at the same time, who's now an old woman who's lost all her children, and she's very upset, and she thinks somehow telling them might help, but of course they have no idea. But they're very careful to tell her that they're very sorry. They would never do such a thing. They think it's awful as well, So they try to create some. They don't want the local people thinking this is what English people do.
Yeah, right. I can imagine.
Not good for the local reputation.
Yeah, exactly. But it's good to hear because I mean, I learned the story of Squanto in grade school, you know,
Right.
and he helped them plant corn. So it's nice to hear that that's actually true. But they leave out the part that, you know, they kidnapped him and put him into slavery and stuff like that.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Well, almost everything in history has a more complicated story than the simple one we like to emphasize. So.
Sure. Right. Yeah. I guess I was just a dumb second grader at the time.
Well, it's fascinating to me that is the story of colonial America that children learn. You know, I mean that narrative was carefully prepared in the 19th century by New Englanders to be the origin story.
Right. Yeah.
know? And they were fighting with Virginians who had a different version of the origin story, which they wanted to have be the more prominent one. So,
yeah, that's a good point. They would want their story.
Well, their story was a little bit more complicated in that it was Pocahontas was a princess, and she married an elite Englishman, John Smith,
right,
and created a kind of English native aristocracy so that there was some way in which the Virginia elite was descended from these elite individuals. And there's a big migration. Well, it's not actually as big as they like to make it sound, but there is a migration in the 1640s and 1650s of people who fought in the English Civil Wars on the side of Charles I. And after he loses and gets his head cut off, some of his soldiers some of his officers come and live in Virginia. And so these are often gentlemen or younger sons of higher elite individual families. And so the Virginians pick up that image too. And that those people are referred to as Cavaliers. So this idea that there were like these Virginia Cavaliers who were elite. So there's a kind of vaguely princess who becomes a Christian and marries into the Virginia, and then these elite men who are there. And the kind of combination of them is pulled together to be seen as the basis of basically the Virginia planter class.
Oh, okay.
So if you watch the movie Gone with the Wind, they actually refer to the Cavaliers and to this romantic vision of Virginia as this upper class society that's very elegant and very romantic. And so this image of the South as having these kind of elite origins that are in some way admirable, was the Virginia version. And then the New England version was like suffering, sacrifice, piety, hard work, etc. So in the end, the New Englanders won.
Right. So it was really just them trying to craft the story that they wanted to share.
Right. Right. And, Plymouth is first in New England, more or less. I mean, there were other English people there, but in terms of settlements, Virginia was first. And Plymouth was first, and also Plymouth has the advantage of never having killed any witches, never. There's some kind of like downsides to the regional history that Virginia doesn't participate in. So, that Plymouth doesn't participate in. So, the Plymouth people, the people who lived in Plymouth, wanted to promote Plymouth, obviously, like locals who were often descended from the first people. They wanted to promote Plymouth, but also I think as a kind of regional story, like if in the 19th century, ideas like killing witches and these sort of negative stories about Massachusetts and what does it mean to be person from that region, the Scarlet Letter, these ideas about hypocrisy, these negative images of religion. So if Massachusetts is going that way in terms of its sort of PR, that's fairly negative. So I think Plymouth, partly because it's small and out of those main trends that were going, those bigger, more famous trends that were going on, seems like a really great place to put the story of sacrifice and hard work, and and that's when all those paintings of landing in the winter and having a first Thanksgiving and all those images, often wearing very dull colors and these sort of, these are not accurate representations, but they're kind of the romantic version of pious, hardworking, self-sacrificing first arrivals is sort of the way that image gets created.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So what did they? Because I think of a pilgrim, I think of they're wearing black and white. They got a big buckle on. Is that real or is that totally fake?
That's not real.
Okay. That was just made up because it was.
They dress just like everybody. There is one group in colonial American history that eventually goes for kind of somber colors, which are the Quakers, the members of the Society of Friends, particularly in Philadelphia area, particularly in the 18th century. And I think that idea that you have to wear somber colors becomes a kind of image of piety in a kind of vague cultural way that then gets read onto these other groups.
I see. Okay.
But it's not actually, based on anything. In fact, one of the chapters in my book, all the chapters in my book start off with a little short story of some sort drawn from some original record. And one of my chapters in my book is about a man who steals red stockings.
Oh.
Out of a window where they were drying on the windowsill in Boston. He goes to visit Boston and he sees these stockings and he steals them and he brings them back to Plymouth and he puts them on. And he gets called into court. Not because he's wearing red, but because all his neighbors know he doesn't have red stockings. I don't know, where did he get those stockings? They know his
wardrobe.
Well, because all your clothes have to come from England.
Yeah, sure.
You don't have very many clothes. The clothes you have, everybody knows. If you get new clothes, people know.
Yeah.
So the fact that he suddenly shows up with red stockings is super suspicious, and the grand jury actually presents him for having red stockings.
Wow.
And they call him in, and he confesses, well, I found him on somebody's windowsill and brought him back from Boston. And they send him back to Boston and say, you have to take these back and tell them that you stole.
Okay.
So, but the point there is it's not the red that's the problem, except that they're noticeable as compared to the stockings he actually owned.
Right. Yeah. Man, that's funny. That's crazy.
Yeah. So, I try to use little stories like that to get into whatever the topic is. And the topic of that is basically about clothing and the need to import it, and they can't make it locally. And therefore, how do they get it? And
right. Yeah.
So they import cloth or already made things.
Okay. Yeah. So they would rely on, England or other places to import stuff that they couldn't get. So they were.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Were they doing kind of a lot of trading and that kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah. A ship comes, except for 1 year in the early period, a ship comes every year. They arrive with a huge part of the early Plymouth story is they arrive with an enormous debt because they can't afford to buy, everything they need to come, and they can't afford to rent a ship and the captain and the crew and stuff. So they get backers in England who agree to back their voyage in exchange for being repaid. So the minute they land, they have a debt that they have to pay off. And the problem is it's hard to come up with something in New England, especially in December, that you can send back that will help to pay off the debt. So they spend decades indebted to these investors and trying to gather up enough. So the investors will then send shoes or clothes or whatever because they know they need them, but then the debt keeps going up.
Right. Yeah.
So they can't seem to get out of it for a long time because the main thing they find that they can export is animal skins, furs, pelt,
sure.
beaver pelts. So they immediately try to set up a trade with the local native peoples in order to get these items, which they can then load on ships and send back. But then there's also the problem of transatlantic transportation on small wooden ships in the early 17th century, which is not a very sure thing. So occasionally, like one of their shipments gets ruined in a shipwreck, another couple of them get taken by pirates, So they just have a lot of different pirates or privateers. They just have a lot of different mishaps. Once the shipment arrives in London during epidemic, it's like a plague year and everybody's sick and basically businesses close down, so their shipment just sits there and doesn't get sold, and so they have various difficulties. They also think they're getting cheated by the people that are keeping the book, and there's all kinds of, and they admit they're really bad at keeping their books, so they don't, when it comes down to it, they don't really know.
Right. Yeah.
So, it's kind of a mess. It takes until 1646 for them to be free of the debt.
Jeez.
So, that's 26 years. That's a long time. So,
man.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
And it's not, early colonies are not big money makers.
Sure.
I mean, anybody who invests in establishing an English outpost in the Americas loses money. It just doesn't. I mean, William Penn ends up in debtor's prison. It's just not lucrative.
Right.
So, the Spanish make a lot of money because they find mines, gold and silver mines, which they then mine, and that ends up being a huge source of wealth for them for, a century or more after they take over what's today Mexico and Peru, which is where the two biggest mines are. But, that's not in the first 10 minutes.
Right, yeah. Takes a while to get that going.
A while. A lot of money is put out to go there and to find these things. And, and the English hope they'll find mines as well, but
okay.
They don't.
So is that kind of like these investors, are they kind of hoping that something like that will happen?
Well, yeah, they're hoping. I mean, what's happened in Virginia by the time we're talking about is that they've discovered tobacco.
Oh, okay.
Which is another way to make money, which is a crop that will grow in a colony that doesn't grow, or at least not well, in England, and for which there's a demand.
Right.
So things like cotton, tobacco, sugar, these kinds of things will eventually be exported. There's also some local, tobacco is an American plant originally.
Oh.
There's other things like, the cocoa plant, the basis of chocolate is also American. So there's some local things that eventually get, pulled into a kind of Atlantic exchange that's lucrative for people who can control it. And then there's things that are already grown in other places like sugar, but the environment in the Americas is good for cultivating it. So there's big sugar plantations eventually in Brazil and in the Caribbean in particular that are hugely profitable. But so that becomes a different model. That agricultural exploitation is a different model than the extraction model. But yeah, the biggest way to wealth initially, and one that everybody thinks would be great if they could get in on it, is mining.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. There's huge amounts of especially silver come out of the Americas. Okay. And it goes to Asia via the Manila Galleon trade that goes across the Pacific from Spanish America. And then it comes back to Europe. Well, But I mean, it finances wars. It changes the economy of Europe. It's, I mean, it's in a world historical sense, it has an enormous impact. What New England has to offer is furs until those are depleted, which doesn't take long. The Dutch are going up the Hudson River and getting them that way. The French are coming in through Quebec and getting them that way. And the English in New England kind of get squeezed in the middle between those two, which have better access. So they work the local rivers in New England for a while, but eventually there's not enough trade in that area. The Plymouth actually establishes fur trading outposts on various rivers because Plymouth is not a great spot for getting furs. Oh. It doesn't have a major river coming into it where you can then, meet native hunters coming down and, so they go to the Connecticut River and they go up to what's today Maine to Kennebec and they get then the river there. And they have trading posts there that are waiting basically for native hunters to come and trade with them so that they can then collect the furs, bring them back to Plymouth, put them on ships and send them back to England. So, but then, other settlers come and then you can't trade on the Connecticut River if Connecticut is a colony that somebody else is owning and telling you to stay out of. So, eventually those fall apart for them. Yeah. Okay. And then but by then, more or less, they're. The other thing in New England is there's two other things. One is fish. Okay. Which is already being extracted in big numbers further north. And the other thing is timber, huge forests. Oh, right. And, and these are quite, they're quite impressive to Europeans because Europeans have basically deforested Europe by this time. They're building wooden ships, they're building wooden houses, they're burning wood for fuel. So, to see enormous forests with really big trees in them and, to them is just phenomenal. And so they start shipbuilding in the region pretty soon after Massachusetts is established. Eventually the king, the naval authorities go through the forests of New England and mark certain trees as belonging to the king because they're a certain kind of pine that's makes a really good mast. If you have to make a very large ship, you need this. So that's another thing. And, and then there's other forest-based products like turpentine and, things that you can produce that are also for naval stores are important that New England has. So New England will find a niche, but it's not going to be a way to make yourself super wealthy. Right. It's not like a sugar plantation in Jamaica in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a more modest mercantile undertaking. Right. So.
Okay. And I think you kind of alluded to this before where you said that they kind of like ran out of furs because they hunted, but was that... I mean, to the Native Americans there, were they able to kind of live and let that ecosystem, be there?
Well, I mean, that's the problem. I think if Plymouth had been it, native life would have been only moderately disrupted by things like disease and trade. Right. But once you have people trading, coming in from every direction and trading, and what happens is, I mean, a number of things happen. One is too many people mean they start fighting over land. Mm-hmm. So there's not a war of any consequence until Massachusetts and Connecticut are founded. And then there's a major regional war because there's all this pressure on land and the native people start to push back more seriously. Sure. Right. So that happens. But the other thing is everybody uses the same furs, same skins, etc. Everybody's hunting for the deer and the beaver and the otter, etc. And if various native communities are all trying to get in on that trade, then you end up having wars among them over resources and access, because they're all going to fight among themselves about, who's going to be able to exploit this connection to the Europeans. So it has various problems, in terms of wars with Europeans over land, but then also wars among natives over the resources, even as the resources are going down.
Wow.
So native people start using more things that come from Europe.
Right, sure.
They start, instead of taking their time to do the traditional ways of creating, say, like bowls and pots and stuff out of gourds and naturally, instead of weaving baskets, instead of making things out of furs, etc., they start, or, deer skins or whatever, they start trading for cloth. And then, then they make their clothes that way, or in part that way, or they start trading for metal items so they can have a metal pot, or so these kinds of material changes sort of insinuate themselves into the environment at the same time that their ability to pursue their older ways of doing things being undermined by other factors.
Right.
So it does. I mean, it's a long-term disease, can come in and wipe out a lot of people at once, but then the presence of this alternate communities, alternate economies, that that has a longer term kind of insidious impact. So a lot of the native peoples that live in New England today basically lost their lands over time.
Yeah.
And some of the fights that are going on about, like, can these communities get recognized? Can they get tribal status? Can they have their casino? These are all very much tied to this history of, these people have been there all along, but are they recognized as being there? And, can you tell? So the historians of these communities have to go through and try to document that, yes, this group that's been living here this whole time, even though the colonial authorities didn't recognize them anymore as a native community, were in effect, the remnants of a much larger native community. So, yeah, it has a huge long-term impact. And there was a famous book, oh man, this must be almost 50 years ago, called Changes in the Land, by an environmental historian, who showed how if you take all the beaver out of the New England landscape, it completely changes the physical landscape.
Really?
Because of the ways beaver impact the landscape.
Right. Sure.
They build these dams, they change the way the water flows, they do all these kind of, so that those kinds of effects are, also have a lot of long-term consequences that aren't intentional or thought through or even necessarily recognized. But if if you're trained to do that kind of historical research, you can see them.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's interesting to think too, because the perspective I have is that, the English just came over and, they just started hunting and took all the beavers, and then they were over hunted and they were gone or whatever. But it makes sense that, the different native communities there would also they would maybe hunt more to then trade for other things and stuff. And then they would start to, clash against each other too. So it was just everybody who just had to get these resources.
Right. At least in Plymouth, the Plymouth residents themselves are not hunting.
Oh, okay.
They're trading. They do bring guns. One of my chapters is about guns, but they do kill birds in particular.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the guns they bring are what they call fowling pieces. But they don't actually go out and they don't have the skills. They don't go out and take the beaver themselves.
Right.
Those are brought to them in trade.
Yeah.
So
I see. So you mentioned birds. Did they get turkey?
I heard years ago that somebody did a big, these archaeological digs at Plymouth, and they've never found a turkey bone. Turkeys the turkeys would have been their wild turkeys. They'd be nothing like what we picture.
Oh, really?
Because those have been so modified. I mean, a modern turkey has a huge breastbone because it's been modified. It's been bred to, a turkey in the wild is a scrawny.
Oh, sure, right.
You couldn't feed the whole family for Thanksgiving on one turkey.
Right.
The meal that they're referring to when they talk about the first Thanksgiving was nothing like what we picture. So
they didn't have.
I mean, those are regional foods of 19th century New England, is what we picture as Thanksgiving. Not the foods that they would have eaten in Plymouth in 1620. The only thing we know, it wasn't a meal, it was sort of more of a harvest celebration, multi-day harvest celebration, more like what you would do in an English village. Only 90 Wampanoag warriors came and brought deer. And so they had a lot of venison.
Mm-hmm.
The meat they favor in New England and really in all the North American colonies in the early years is pork.
Really?
Yeah, they like pigs because pigs are mean. and pigs, you can turn them loose and they will fend for themselves. I mean, there were wolves in New England, so you could lose them to wolves, but in general, they can look after themselves. And there's lots of records from New England in the 17th century of native communities fighting with English communities about semi-feral pigs that are coming and rooting up native crops. Because the English are not pinning them in. They're just letting them go and, branding them and letting them go. And then they're going and tearing up, other people's corn and beans and squash and, so.
Right.
Yeah, they ate a lot of pork.
Okay. Bacon's good, I guess. Everyone loves bacon. Okay, so there were Native Americans, you said, from the Wampanoag tribe at the
I just read something written by a Native scholar who actually points out that they have this harvest. It's their first, the end of their first year there, and they have actually successfully planted some things and they harvest it, and they decide they're going to have a little celebration because they've been, they've been dealing with a lot of dearth. And so they're going to have this celebration, and they do a little martial display where they all come out beating the drum and they shoot off all their guns and stuff. And so the scholar actually says, if this was an intimidation tactic to the local Native tribes, then the fact that 90 warriors show up
right, yeah,
was, you could read that as in a very different way than if, it was just like, come to our party sort of thing.
Yeah, right. Was it intimidation?
But they did stay and partake, and they did bring deer, which they were good at hunting, and the English not so much.
Right, yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So, and there's lots of seafood, of course, in the area. So seasonally available. So that there was that as well.
Right, yeah.
They could harvest at certain times.
Cool.
So.
Man, well, I love hearing about this stuff, Carla. I'm so glad thank you for coming on and sharing this stuff. It's so interesting to me. I love it. I mean, is there anything, we'll kind of wrap it up a bit, but is there anything that you want to, share, or you want people to think about, change their perspective on the Pilgrims or anything like that? Well,
you'll notice I've never used the word pilgrim.
It's all me using it. Yeah.
So that's one thing I actually, they don't call themselves that.
Okay.
They refer to themselves that way metaphorically, but what they mean twice in the early records, but what they mean is that they're wanderers.
Okay.
They're actually quoting a passage in the Old Testament, and it's about wandering, not having a home.
Right.
And
Makes
the way
sense.
we use it in our national mythology is we think of them as kind of purposefully pilgrimage to America, creating this new, society, nation, whatever. And that's exactly the opposite of what they mean the few times they say it. So I've avoided the term because it seems to me to be, definitely as applied to them, it's a later coinage, but it also seems to me to be a little bit misleading of what they were about.
Okay. I like that. That's good to know. So let's share your book again. The World of Plymouth Plantation comes out October 6th. Should we send any people anywhere specific to get that?
Well, it's published by Harvard University Press, but it'll be all the usual Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all the usual places people go to buy books. So
right, cool.
Yeah, should be out there, and there's going to be an audiobook, which I've never had before.
Oh, nice! Congrats.
All the books I've published before, there's never been an audiobook made.
Okay, right on. An audio. I love audiobooks, so that's good to hear. Cool.
Yeah, so if we ever go back to having commutes, someone can listen to the audiobook in their commute.
Right, yeah, very true. Cool. Well, for people listening, I'll have a link in the description so they can click on your book and get that easy. But this was great. I really appreciate it, Carla. It's super fun.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah. Well, thanks for talking about it. I, of course, always like to talk about the things I study, so it was fun for me.
Cool. Well, glad to hear it. So thanks again, and have a good rest of your day. Enjoy your weekend.
Okay. You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.